This cross is like 40 years old. This cross is 40 years old, at least 40 years old, from when I was back, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer.
Hello and welcome, I'm Tafaragadamu. That is Karen Dewitt, a Peace Corps volunteer from way back in the 1960s. I wouldn't have known how to do what I'm doing now had I not been in Ethiopia, she says. And when I did this conversation in 2008, she already had a colorful career as a teacher, a journalist, and a writer.
I got a call, you were actually buzzed, and was told that I had a telephone call from Washington. I came down and the guy said, congratulations, you've been accepted into the Peace Corps. I didn't know where I was going, but I just thought, well, this is exciting. This is much more exciting than going to graduate school and, studying 19th century British literature. And the first part of the training was that Peace Corps had discovered that they got better volunteers if they knew the language. And so they had us train. Between my junior and senior year, I went to UCLA and studied Amharic with Wolf Leslau, who's a very famous academician who learned, studied Amharic, and a whole slew of Ethiopians who taught English. There was a famous Ethiopian poet, Solomon Deresa. He was there. There was Hailu Fulas, who was also one of the teachers there. So we studied Amharic all summer long. I actually was a very good Amharic student. I learned how to write it, babu, biba, bo, sats, us, all of those kinds of things. I'm very lucky. My parents have always encouraged all of us to be very, very independent, maybe sometimes too independent. The first, right after I'd been accepted, and my father died, and I broke down in tears, like I would here. And I had two friends, one of whom is dead now, Nancy from Chicago and Elaine from Oklahoma. And they took me out for ice cream. I know this sounds really funny, but it's exactly what I needed. And they took me to put me on the plane. Nancy's father had died as well. And I went home, and we had the funeral and things like that. And then I came back. And at that time, I don't know if they still had them, but they had therapists in the Peace Corps to make sure you weren't crazy. And I remember when I came back, the therapist said, well, are you still going in the Peace Corps? And I said, oh, yes, why wouldn't I? He said, well, your father died. I said, well, my father wanted me to have a bigger life. Yeah, why wouldn't I? So that was my first hurdle, because when I came back, the big thing was, well, are you stable enough? So then I remember talking to my mom, because I had two younger brothers, and I said, well, is there enough money? Do I need to drop out of college? And my mother was actually angry that I thought about that. She said, oh, no, your father and I have planned for you all to all go to college. We plan for you to go on a trip after you graduate from college. So no, don't even think of not going on with your life. So I remember asking my mom, my mother worked for the federal government. So a lot of people ask her, well, aren't you worried about Karen going off so far away? And she did inquire for the Peace Corps, and they said, well, actually, your daughter is probably far safer in Ethiopia than she is on the streets of major American cities. And I remember coming in over Addis. It was very interesting, because people had said that it was green like a forest and you wouldn't see a lot of buildings. And it was incredible to see the city with all of these trees in between it, between places. It was just amazing green, and it was cold. I remember it was really cold because, oh God, when did we arrive? We must have arrived in June, July, in the rainy season. So it was really cold in Addis. It was so cold that they actually had hail came down, so that it was freezing. And I remember writing my mother a letter and asking her to send me heavy wool sweaters and boots for the winter time, because it was so cold. Arangwade. I said I wanted Arangwade Agar. I wanted a green country. And so I got Walisa, and it was perfect for me. It was wonderful. It was far enough away from the capital. It was countryside. I taught English, as I said, as a second language, grades 7 through 11. I lived in a typical Ethiopian house. When I tell people, people say, oh, did you live in a mud house? I was like, yes, of course I did, but it doesn't look like mud. I said it looked like stucco. It was bright pink on the outside, because they had put wet paper on it and painted it, and it was blue on the inside. It was probably as big as my kitchen, and it was wonderful. There's a famous Japanese poet named Basho, who writes a haiku, and it's called "In My Bamboo Hut This Spring, There's Nothing, There's Everything." And that's exactly what that house was for me. It was, you know, it was very small. It had a living room, a small kitchen, well, what was a kitchen for me, and a small bedroom. And then, of course, it had a mod bay, an actual kitchen behind it. But at that time, Peace Corps volunteers usually supported some students. So I had supported students, and they lived in the mod bay and did errands for me. Like, at that time, I smoked cigarettes. They'd go get cigarettes. And I love Ethiopia rainy season. And, you know, the house that I lived in, and I guess many Ethiopian houses had tin roofs. And if you have friends over, you can't hear somebody this close away. You know, I mean, it's just incredible, you know. And it's one of the most soothing things I can think of is the sound of the rain during the high rainy season, when you get just incredible deluge of water on the roof. So I would write about that. And I also had tape recorders, so sometimes I would send tapes of, you know, and I would say, I remember one that I sent home was, you know, you can hear the rain. I said, you know, Ethiopia is really high, and it really doesn't have like 4 seasons. It has 2 seasons, and we're at the height of the rainy season. And I want you to just listen to the sound of the rain on the roof. So there were 2 volunteers. There had been volunteers in Waliso since the very beginning of the Peace Corps, and we were the 7th group. So actually, Senator Paul Songas had been a Peace Corps volunteer. He was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers, and he served in that town. Years later, he's dead now, but years later I talked to him, and he was talking about how in Ethiopia he'd gotten his first experience of people accepting him being able to do stuff. Waliso, which is also called Gion, has Filawuha, I mean hot water springs. So we were really lucky volunteers in that we could go down to the water and use hot water. Most of the time I actually bathed in a metal pan about this thing. I would heat the water up on a wood stove and pour it in there and then wash with a cup and then wash it off. But every now and then we'd go down to the Ross Hotel, which was expensive, and take a bath there and swim in the pool. In Gion at that time, about 8 o'clock in the evening, the lights went out. Now we had electricity, but at 8 o'clock in the evening, no more electricity. So we used what was called a Petromax lantern. The Peace Corps volunteers got together with Ethiopian friends. We had, at that time, Peace Corps book lockers. You were given a book locker of all kinds of literature. And we would get together and make 2 things. We would make fudge and bread, Western bread, and read to one another. So, for example, I know all of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit because they were in our Peace Corps books, and we'd get together and read to one another. Just that was entertainment by the light of these Petromax lanterns. So there was a very peaceful existence in many ways. There was a hill outside Waliso called Abogar, and we'd go out in the moonlight when the stars were out and look at the stars and listen to the hyenas, and go whoop, whoop. It was wonderful. I bought a horse. This was one of the things that I did because I thought, I'm never going to own a horse in the United States because it costs too much to maintain it. But I thought one of the things I'll do is I'll buy a horse when I'm here so I can ride. I rode when I was in college, and I thought I'll ride my horse. A friend of mine came actually from Addis who had relatives who were like about 5 kilometers beyond Waliso. So we rode out with, I don't know if it was an aunt or something, but she made coffee, and you know, the typical Ethiopian way of roasting the coffee, then grinding the coffee, and then it was the first time I ever had coffee with butter and salt, you know, and I was like, butter and salt. And then I thought, well, that's not any stranger than having cream in your coffee, because what does cream become? Cream becomes butter eventually. So I've been drinking butter in my coffee anyway, because it's the same thing. Well, I love Ethiopian food. I like really hot food, and so it was perfect for me. Ethiopian chickens. Now, in the United States, you can go to real high-class restaurants, and they have what they call free-range chickens, meaning the chicken isn't cooped up and fed all the time. It gets to wander around. Well, Ethiopia is a country full of free-range chickens, and a real free-range chicken is tough, but I didn't know this. So the first time I went to the mercado in Waliso, I got the chicken, and I asked my students to kill the chicken. And they said, oh, but we're from the city. We don't know anything about killing chickens. And I was like, well, you don't know how to kill a chicken? And they were like, no. I said, well, then I'll kill the chicken. And they said, oh, Miss, you can't kill the chicken. I was like, oh, yes, I can kill the chicken. I didn't realize they were saying that women on the whole don't kill things. So, I mean, I went out in the back, I chopped the chicken's head off, I threw it in the yard, and it was like this, well, for the next week, people were, you know, people would go, she's the woman who killed the chicken. It was amazing to me. I didn't realize that it was really offensive that I had killed this thing. But anyway, I killed the chicken, and I got the reputation as the woman who killed the chicken. And I continued to kill chickens because my students didn't know. And I said, well, if you guys don't know how to kill chickens, I'm going to kill the chickens and you're going to pluck the chickens. So I got them, I made them pluck the chicken because I said, I killed it, you pluck it. So then I made a fried chicken, typical American dish. So, you know, you dip the chicken in egg, you roll it in some flour, you put it in the pan and you fry it up. Well, you could have bounced that chicken on the floor. It was so tough. It was like a rubber ball. But I did learn how to cook chicken eventually in Ethiopia, which is the way Ethiopians do it, slowly. Like you cook it in a what? I learned to cook it so that you bake the chicken a really long time, then you take it apart, and then you make fried chicken. So it was like a 3-hour preparation to make chicken. But melt in the mouth, and flavor. That's the other thing. I remember Ethiopian tomatoes. They were full of seeds, but they were so delicious. I haven't tasted a tomato like that ever again. When I came back to the United States, we don't make tomatoes like this. But thin skin, incredible taste, pungent, full of seeds, absolutely delicious. Ragi bowls for my kitfo.
From?
Oh, these are from the Mercato in Addis. And now that I'm back, I get, every 2 months, I get a craving for kitfo. I mean, I have to have kitfo. And I mean, in the avisha, I want it raw, no fire at all. And that, the smell of berbere and butter on my fingers, it's like Ethiopia to me again, you know. Eucalyptus fires and the smell of berbere on my fingers, it's amazing. One time I was eating here in Washington, there's a lot of Ethiopian restaurants, but I was at one called Dukum, and we don't really have torrential rains very often in the summer, but they had a torrential rain. I mean, the rain was just pouring, and I thought, I was sitting outside, and I thought, this is so like Ethiopia, you know, hearing Ethiopian music, the waitresses talking in Amharic, and the smell of berbere on my fingers. I said, I could be in Addis right now. It's wonderful, wonderful memories. I came back to the United States and got a job. And when I came back to New York, I lived in New York. I still had this, because I spoke Amharic, actually my Amharic I think sometimes is cleaner and better now. I liked the Arab world as a result of Ethiopia, and I worked for Our Reports, which is an Arab economic weekly, the Beirut Daily Star, which is the largest English language newspaper in the Middle East. I did freelance radio broadcasting for ABC, CBS, and Westinghouse. We came back to the United States, and then I had a career in newspapers. I worked for the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, did a lot of freelancing for National Geographic, just a lot, magazines and things like that. And then at 50, well, actually at 47, Nightline approached me and talked to me about coming to work for them as what they call an editorial producer. But I was having a good time at New York Times, so I didn't go. And a couple years later, they came back and said, well, we have a senior producer slot open. Would you be interested in that? So I thought, God, I'm 50 years old. When am I ever going to do something, you know, slightly different? So I went into television and was a senior producer at Nightline for 3 years. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a fine writer, a fiction writer, but writing fiction is a hard way to live. So I thought I come from a family that, you know, once you're out of college, you got to get a job to do something. So I figured that the best way to become a writer was to get a job writing, and then in my spare time, which of course I've never had, I'd become a fiction writer. I'd write fiction. The thing I learned about myself in Ethiopia, and I wrote a story in a collection of Peace Corps stories, is you think as a Peace Corps volunteer naively, you know, that as an American from a developed country that you have a lot to give. You have more to give than you're going to be given. And the reality is I was given much, much more than I gave. The one thing I learned in Ethiopia that I wouldn't have learned otherwise is that I had a gift for teaching. I would never have expected. My father taught. It was the last thing from my mind, the furthest thing from my mind. It was something I did not want to do because women were, at that time in the United States, programmed into being teachers and nurses. And I thought, I'm not going to do any of those traditional female things. Didn't want to be a lawyer or a doctor. I wanted to have adventures mostly. I mean, that's Ethiopia opened that up for me. But there were many things that come from being an arrogant American that I learned about me. I come from Ohio. I've had a garden since I was 5 and 6 years old, and I remember I was going to grow tomatoes. And in America at the time, you would stake tomatoes. That is, you would have one stick and then you tie the tomato plant. I remember my students saying, no, no, miss, you have to build this sort of cage for the tomatoes so that the tomatoes could sort of wander freely. And I said, oh, well, I'm going to grow them the way we grow them in America. You grow them the way you grow them in Ethiopia. Well, guess who got more tomatoes? My students got more tomatoes than I did because they knew what they were doing. And I've used this example. I spoke at West Point about blowback, about U.S. policies and how we often impose them in places or we think we're doing good and then we get blowback that's unexpected. And I used that example of growing tomatoes as another example. Here is soil that I don't know, and I'm planting something of my own in this soil expecting to get what I would get at home, and I don't. Whereas, you know, Ethiopians know Ethiopia. They know what grows best, and indeed that's what they got. They got the better thing. They got the better tomatoes. My tomatoes were little eensy, weensy, anemic things, and my kids got a heck of a lot more. So, and for me, you know, when you look at a world map and you see all of these countries in different colors and things, for me, when I see the shape of Ethiopia, I know that country intimately. I have an intimate relationship with the country that I wouldn't, in a way that I don't have with any place else, because I lived there for 2 years and I lived like the people. I went back to Waliso in December of 2007, and I went down just for the day because that's where they're now training the Peace Corps volunteers. And I was with one of the Ethiopian teachers who teaches language, and she kept saying, "You are so," she said, "you are so happy, you are so happy." And I was, because I could see the bones of the village that I lived in, even in the town that Waliso is now. And I remember we were walking up the main road where my horse and I once slipped in the rain. And I could see the school in front of me, and then we turned right towards where the Ross Hotel used to be. I can't think of what it's called now. And as we walked along, and I said, I know I live up here to the left. I lived up here to the left. And sure enough, there was the house. And it just made me tremendously happy. I'm more interested in Ethiopia now, I think, than I was 40 years ago.
Oh, amazing.
Look it up.